My name is Bill Haltom, and I'm in Nashville, Tennessee today, October 21st, 2010, to interview Justice George H. Brown, Jr. This interview is taking place as part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation in conjunction with the Tennessee Supreme Court Historical Society. Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
We are here in the beautiful Supreme Court courtroom, a couple of Memphians in the Supreme Court courtroom here in Nashville. And well, I need to start off, probably the only formal part of this is, would you tell us your full name, Your Honor?
My full name is George H. Brown, Jr. The H stands for Henry.
Okay.
My mother called me George Henry, but nobody except folk who have been knowing me for many, many years uses all of those names.
And tell us your date of birth.
July 16, 1939.
And you were born where, sir?
In Memphis, Tennessee.
Did you grow up in Memphis?
I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee.
Tell us a little bit about your childhood in Memphis, your family and your background.
We lived in South Memphis. My mother and father and two siblings. We happened to live on a small street called Clack Place. And one significant fact about that is that A.E. Latting lived two doors from us.
A.E. Latting was?
A.E. Latting, the attorney, a prominent attorney in Memphis, Tennessee.
One of the forerunner African-American attorneys in the history of Memphis.
That's
yes,
correct.
Sir.
Yeah. So the accident of living two doors from Mr. Latting, in retrospect, has had a profound effect on my life and career.
How old were you when you first remember Mr. Latting? What's your earliest memory of him?
Oh, probably 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, somewhere in there, when I was very young.
Did your parents identify, or was he known in the community as a lawyer?
Yes, he was known as a lawyer. He had he had a son, Arvis, that is 3 years older than I am, and so we played together, and I spent a lot of time with his son Arvis as well as with his family. So I was able to see him and observe him in many capacities, as a father, as a neighbor, and as I grew older, was able to see and observe him and know him as a lawyer.
Can you do you remember a time in your childhood, either inspired by him or someone else, that you first thought, I'd like to be a lawyer someday?
I think the thing, Bill, I would call it unconscious inspiration, because I don't have any conscious recollection of ever wanting to be anything other than a lawyer, nor do I have a conscious recollection that I want to be a lawyer. It's just, I think it was something that perhaps evolved. There were no lawyers in my family. There were teachers, there were ministers. My grandfather on my mother's side was a physician, but no lawyers.
Tell me about your parents.
My mother was a school teacher.
Where?
In Memphis, Tennessee. She taught at various schools in Memphis, Georgia Elementary, Grant School, and my father was a car cleaner at the Illinois Central Railroad.
Really? I apologize. I meant to ask your parents' names, too.
My mother was named Sarah, and my father was George H. Brown, Sr., so I'm a junior.
And did you have brothers and sisters?
I have a brother and a sister. I'm the oldest, a brother, Alfred, who is a dentist in Memphis, and my sister, Sarita, who resides in Orlando, Florida.
And so your mother taught school?
Yes.
And what grade again?
She was an elementary school teacher.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your father worked for the old Illinois Central Railroad?
For about 35 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So where was the railroad station for the Illinois Central in Memphis in those days? Was which one? Was it the Union Station, or was it?
No, it's the station at Calhoun in Maine and Calhoun.
Okay.
In all my life, at least my childhood life, I recall my father getting up in the morning, going to work, and coming home, 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. 5 o'clock in the evening, that is. And I say that that's something that many of us take for granted. But all my childhood life, I recall parents getting up, going to work in the morning, and coming home in the afternoon, and there we would be.
So you had the role models of your parents and their work ethic, and then you had a prominent lawyer in the community that inspired you as well.
You're correct. You're correct.
Tell us a little bit about what it was like. What are your memories of being a child in Memphis, Tennessee, and I guess during the World War II and those years in the 40s and in the 50s?
Well, obviously Memphis was segregated at that time. To what extent I observed that, or probably very little. It was a way of life, and so my father did go away to serve in the Navy during that period of time. But again, that was at a time that I was very young, probably 3 or 4 or something, 3, 4, 5 years of age. We were, I say we were probably poor, but we were not poor, if you may say that. We always owned our own home on Clack. My parents always were employed, as I indicated. We went to church on Sunday, and we were active in the church and active in the community with various neighborhood clubs. And I went to school at LaRose. I went to school at Booker Washington, and I have pleasant memories of school, as well as generally pleasant memories of Memphis during my childhood, notwithstanding the folkways and mores that existed at that particular time.
When you were a child growing up in Memphis, in a segregated city, in the 40s and in the 50s, what were your dreams? Did you feel there were limitations, or did you feel like that there was nothing that was going to hold you back? How did you look at life in terms of your dreams?
Well, as I indicated, Bill, I always wanted to be a lawyer. I knew that I would be going to college. I knew my sisters and brothers would be going to college. My father was a strong model. Though he did not go to college, he was not educated. He was a very wise man, and felt strongly about education, and so pushed us to get a good education. Not only that, he pushed us to get involved in what you might consider extracurricular activities. I was involved, all of us were involved in music at an early age. I played the piano at an early age, then later clarinet and alto sax, and I think about it in retrospect. He saw that we received private lessons in music. One significant thing that I recall, I played clarinet, and then later I wanted to play alto saxophone. And while my father was a product of the Depression and a very frugal man, and I'm being gracious when I use the word frugal, I should say he was just plain tight. He bought me an alto saxophone, which was a Selma Parrish, which was the top of the line. And I later, after he had died, wondered what motivated him to buy such an expensive horn where he could have gotten one much less expensive. And so I don't know, other than I conclude that somebody convinced him that he ought to get the best for his son.
Now, I happen to know, Your Honor, because I've known you for about 30 years, that you are a jazz aficionado.
I love it. I love good music, but particularly jazz.
Well, do you still have your alto sax?
I sold my alto saxophone that my father paid about $300 for to Dr. Bill Hurd here in Memphis for $2,000.
Really?
And Bill said, "Well, you could have gotten more for it." I said, "I don't want it. I didn't want any more for it. I wanted you to have it because I know you."
So
I don't play saxophone anymore. I take piano lessons.
Really?
Yeah,
really?
I take jazz piano lessons.
When did you start taking jazz piano lessons?
As soon as I announced that I was going to retire from the bench. So I've been doing that approximately 5.5 years.
All right, do you do any concerts?
No, it's for my own personal enjoyment, and I don't think I ought to force my playing off on others. Not yet, anyway.
When you were a young man growing up and you were playing the alto sax and the clarinet, what music programs were you involved in? The school, or were you?
I was involved in school music programs, and then we did play what we call gigs. I did play dances and things around the tri-state area when I was in high school, and then after high school, I went to Florida A&M on a band scholarship and played in the Marching 100 at Florida A&M.
I want to get to that in a second. That's very interesting. But let me talk some more about the music. You said you played gigs. I'm just curious. Where were some of the places you would play in Memphis in the 40s and 50s?
Well, down at Foot Holmes Auditorium, they used to have dances down there. We played a lot of dances over at Lemoyne College. Lemoyne College. And a lot of dances in northern Mississippi as far as southern Missouri.
Really?
I remember a significant dance we played over at Arkansas State College. So just in the general tri-state area.
You told us you went to what we call in Memphis BTW.
Memphis,
Booker T. Washington.
Right.
Which is, gosh, how old is Booker T. Washington, Your Honor?
I have no idea, but it's probably the second oldest, at least predominant African American high school in Memphis.
And I guess the list of graduates of BTW comprise a who's who of the African American community in Memphis. Along
with Manassas High School, I want to give Manassas High School. Those were the two oldest high schools, and anybody, if they were older than I am, came from one of those two schools for the most part.
Did you have any? Do you remember any particular teachers you had at Booker T. Washington that helped you along the way on that dream of becoming a lawyer and eventually a judge?
That's a good question. I've been fortunate, Bill, to have good English teachers. One in particular at Booker Washington was Mrs. Annette Hubbard Roberts. And I don't recall any discussions about law or any career. She was an extraordinarily demanding English teacher. In retrospect, both at Booker Washington and at Florida A&M, I had the benefit of outstanding English teachers. When I went to Florida A&M, my aunt, Annette Thorpe, who still lives, was an English professor. And it just so happened that while I didn't want to be in her classes because, one, she was demanding, and two, she was my aunt, she saw to it that I enrolled in classes of excellent English teachers. So in retrospect, I've had the benefit of great English teachers both in high school as well as in college.
What was it about these teachers? Are you talking about writing, reading?
I think it was a general demand of all of the above. And I think I took away from those academic experiences an ability to write. I'm not sure that I read a lot as a high school student. I think I began reading as an avocation after I finished college when I was in the Army in Germany. There I started reading, and I think my interest in reading somehow just blossomed. I don't know whether it was my way of preparing myself to go to law school. But I don't recall being much of a reader in high school. My interest there was mainly music. My extracurricular activity was music then, and I think as I got older, I began to develop a great interest in reading. But that foundation perhaps was a result of these English teachers. I do recall having to write, I think what they used to call a lot of essays. We did a great deal of that both in high school and in college.
Do you remember any essay in particular you wrote along the way that still comes to mind?
No, none in particular, no. I've written some recently. It's interesting you asked me that question. I wrote an essay, I guess since I've been a judge in the art of doing nothing. One day I just sat down and wrote about doing nothing.
Tell us about that.
Well, Bill, I have this theory that you have to consciously decide to do nothing. You may go on a vacation, and you may go on one vacation and say, well, we're going to see the Louvre, we're going to go to this museum, and we're going to that museum, and then you fill the whole vacation up with activities. Or you may take a vacation and say, this is going to be a do-nothing vacation. All you're going to do is inhale and exhale, or to use a word that I use, you're going to just chill. And so you do nothing. You don't watch your watch. You don't have an agenda. You just veg out. But I think that is a practice that you have to think about how to do it, and some of us, because of how we are wired, have to unplug ourselves in order to do it. So one day I had nothing to do, so I wrote an essay on doing nothing.
Who did you write this for? Did you write this for yourself?
I guess I had nothing else to do, and probably had a conversation with somebody, and I said, well, let's see what would happen if I sit down and wrote an essay on doing nothing. And I shared it with certain people. I got to find it. I don't know where it is now.
Was there any irony to the idea of sitting down and writing an essay about doing nothing? Because you were obviously doing something when you were writing the essay.
I think sometimes you have to think about doing nothing so that you do nothing in the effective way.
Yeah. You know, I hear some lawyers talk sometime about that lawyers used to, an important part of lawyering used to be detached reflection, actually stopping and thinking about what you're going to advise a client. And now in an era of billable hours, and that there's not as much detached reflection. When you were a lawyer, and we're going to spend a lot more time with it later, but when you were a lawyer and a judge, did you try to quote unquote do nothing from time to time?
When I was a lawyer, Bill, I didn't have the luxury of doing nothing. I was never in a large law firm. I was the cook, the bottle washer, and everything. I was at some point I was a sole practitioner, and later in a small firm, but I didn't have that luxury in that part of my professional life.
We'll come back. We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Let me go back to high school and your music, and you indicated you got a music scholarship to Florida A&M.
Right.
First of all, what year did you graduate from Booker T. Washington?
1956.
And when did you first? You had an aunt at Florida A&M.
Yes.
When did you first begin to think about attending college at Florida A&M University?
Well, knowing my father, as I have learned to know him as I've gotten older, he probably had something to do with influencing me to go in that direction. One, I was able to get a scholarship. Two, there were surrogate parents there at Florida A&M. Three, he thought that I ought to be in advanced ROTC at some school, and Florida A&M offered that also. So I think through those subtle influences, that's where I ended up.
For those of us that don't know, A&M stands for?
Agricultural and Mechanical University.
And Florida A&M is located?
In Tallahassee, Florida.
Tallahassee.
Right.
And well, tell us about what so you have a young man from Memphis who goes away. I guess that's the first time you'd gone away from home, was to go to Florida and A&M. Is that correct?
No, probably not. No.
Okay.
No. I remember. I don't know where my father was, but I remember a particular trip where my mother took all of us to Los Angeles. We took the train to Los Angeles, California, when I was about 12, 13, 14. I had an aunt and uncle who lived in Louisville, Kentucky. I recall going up there quite a bit. My father worked on the railroad, so we could get railroad passes. And then I had visited Tallahassee several times before going to school.
So Florida A&M was not, you were going off to college, but you had some family there and you had some connections there and you'd been there before.
Right, right.
Tell us about the music scholarship.
Well, I played clarinet in the high school band, and I received a band scholarship to Florida A&M, and down there I played clarinet in the marching band and played alto saxophone in the symphonic band at Florida A&M.
Were you a music major?
No, I was a political science major.
Oh, poli-sci.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So you go to Florida A&M on a music scholarship, but decide to major in political science.
Oh, I wanted to be a lawyer.
All right. That was still a part of your dream of being a lawyer.
Yeah, go to law school, yes.
Yeah. Were there any teachers? Well, you mentioned your English teachers. Any other teachers at Florida A&M that were an inspiration to you?
We had a strong political science department there. I remember Dr. Howard there. That was quite influential. But more importantly, it was probably just a general atmosphere of the school. Perhaps my greatest influence there was a fraternity that I joined.
What was the name of the fraternity?
Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. I went to school. I knew at some point I wanted to become a member of this fraternity because Mr. Ladding and other members of the community that I knew were in that fraternity. And the first semester I didn't make, my grade point was not sufficient to pledge that fraternity. So I was motivated to kind of work a little bit harder to get my grade point up so that the following semester I could pledge that fraternity. Their standards on Florida A&M's campus were a bit higher than the other fraternities, the academic standards, in order to join. And so I wanted to be in that fraternity, so I was motivated to hit another gear in order to get into that fraternity, which I eventually did. The culture of the fraternity was of such that in order to come to the meeting and participate and talk and be a part of the meeting, your grades had to be at a certain level. In other words, if they were on the low end, you were supposed to be quiet. And I was motivated to be a part of this group, so I was motivated to make sure that my academic performance was sufficient so that I would be a full-fledged member of this group. The group was quite involved in the politics of the school. We took the position that we wanted to always control the SGA, the Student Government Association, and the way that you became a member of the SGA, you had to be a president or the vice president of certain other organizations on the campus, like the Political Science Club or the Chemistry Club and what have you. So the Alphas were very active in student government. We always tried to control the student government. One of the things that I learned, it's a saying, one of the things I learned out of being a part of the fraternity, we said that we always go to meetings where our interests might be adversely affected. And so I remember that to this day. So I think that much of my influence on the campus was a result of peer pressure for excellence. Also, the influence of the band Dr. Foster, who just passed away recently. It was an excellent organization, and it was the first organization that I had been in where there was no compromise for excellence.
You're talking about the band now?
The band. In other words, if we were expected to leave at 8 o'clock, we left at 8 o'clock. He was a very courtly individual, and as a young teenager going from Memphis there to become a part of such an august organization as the band caused me to experience and get some discipline in terms of excellence and accountability. So I think that much of my influence there probably came from sources other than the professors.
You mentioned the band earlier, but tell us again the name of the band.
The Marching 100.
And this is a band that had then and maintains a national
That's
name.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. And Dr. Foster was the
band director.
The band director.
Right, right.
And did you travel much with the band?
The band traveled all through the state of Florida, annual trips to Miami. At that time, they had what they called the Orange Blossom Classic that was played in Miami. We always would go to Jacksonville, and then we would normally go to North Carolina to play some of the schools there during football season, North Carolina A&T and what have you. So there was quite a bit of travel and quite a bit of activity, particularly during football season.
I want to come back to political science because you mentioned that when you were young, when you were even a child, you always wanted to go into law. But political science and law are not necessarily the same thing. Did you, as a young person, develop an interest in politics, or is that simply a subset of law?
Not really. I don't think I had a particular interest in politics. I think I may have run for some political office at Booker Washington, but at Florida A&M, no particular interest in politics. I think I had been told that political science was something that I ought to consider majoring in to go to law school. Now, often when people talk to me about what they ought to major in, more often than not, I suggest English. Particularly on the...
Why is that?
Because of the communication skills, the ability to write, the ability to read, the requirement to read in English, the requirement to listen, the whole communication skills, I think perhaps are developed maybe a little bit more in English maybe than in political science. And a lot of it, I think, Bill, depends on who I'm talking to. If I think that they may have a greater deficiency in English, I will say English. If a person may come out of a secondary background where I think that their English skills are pretty solid, then I'm not sure it makes a lot of difference what they major in.
Were you in student government at Florida A&M?
No. Only involved with the fraternity, but no, I was involved in the band, involved in ROTC, and involved in having a good time.
Well, tell me again the years you were at Florida State.
I was
Florida
there.
A&M, excuse me.
Florida A&M, I was there from 56 to 60.
Now, that was an interesting time in the history of our country.
Right.
Were you, what were the issues that students were concerned about on the campus of Florida A&M in the mid to late 1950s? You
know, in the late 50s, around maybe I think 59, I recall Congress or Racial Equality Corps coming to Florida A&M. I think it was at that time that this was probably the precursor of the Citian movement. I recall a meeting with some people who had come to town recruiting students to get involved, and it was either my junior year or my senior year. I know that at that time I was in advanced ROTC, and it was at a time that I could see graduation. The point that I'm making is it was clearly not my freshman or sophomore year. It was either the latter part of my third year or the beginning of my fourth year. And I remember a meeting talking about sitting in and getting involved in civil rights. I declined to get involved in that at that time, thinking that, number one, I was so close to graduation. Number two, I was in advanced ROTC, and I know that an arrest, even an arrest at that time, would have been a death knell to any advancement at that point. I remember that. I didn't think much of it at the time, but in retrospect, I can see where that was the precursor of the beginning of the civil rights movement. And if I can digress a minute, I read Dyami Bailey's book, and Dyami—
This is Judge,
yes,
retired
Judge
Judge
Dyami Bailey. He was behind me in school about probably 3 years, and I read with great interest his involvement at Southern University. And I reflected on how 2 or 3 years can make an extraordinary difference in the experiences that one might have had at that time. His experiences were much different than mine, and there's only about a 3-year gap. I think that when I was a senior, probably Dyami was a freshman in college at Southern. So I did not get involved in that for the reasons that I stated. And I thought it at that time that my contribution could be better if I were equipped with a good education, if I were equipped with a law degree, than getting involved at that time when I was not in a position to get involved and pay the price, and at the same time further my education career. I was a good student, but I wasn't a superior student. So I didn't think that I could manage the time or that diversion. And last but not least, Big George back here in Memphis was not going to look too
Referring to your
kind of
father.
that. Yes, my father.
ROTC.
Yes.
ROTC stands for?
Reserve Officers Training Corps.
And this was military, this was preparing you, you were planning on going into the Army.
Right. You remember, you may not know, but at that time, the draft was mandatory. You had the draft at that particular time. So one could make a decision of going into ROTC and then satisfying that obligation that you might have, or not going into ROTC and discharging that obligation as an enlisted man. And my father felt that the former was the better approach to take than to go as an enlisted man, since he had been in the Navy as an enlisted man.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, your father was in the Navy during World War II?
Yes.
And what was his position in the Navy?
He came out as a chief petty officer. He served in Iwo Jima, and I learned about Okinawa and all of that because of where he served. What
was it your father one of the inspirations for you to, an inspiration may not be the right word, direction for you to go into ROTC at Florida A&M?
Either inspiration or direction. It was probably more direction.
But at that time, you said earlier as a child, you always expected you knew you were going to go to college. And
yes.
Because of your father's naval experience, did you always anticipate that you would serve our country in the military?
I don't know whether I thought about that. Yeah, my father had an extraordinary influence on me, as you probably have surmised, and he had a way. And it's interesting for me to think about it now that I've gotten much older. People say, well, how did you happen to play the piano when you were young? I said, I don't know. Probably my dad said, well, you're going to play the piano. and that was it. And probably with regard to ROTC or some other things like that, he said, well, I think you ought to do this. And I probably didn't question it that much.
What are some of the things you learned from ROTC at Florida A&M?
Again, I think that I was a good candidate to learn a lot of discipline. And between the band and ROTC, I think that they took a fairly wild teenager and caused that teenager to adhere to some rules and some regulations and some structure that I otherwise would not have gotten. And I think that's what I got from that. I think that I got it fighting and screaming, but I think I took that away from that experience.
What position did you hold in ROTC at Florida A&M?
I was probably merely a captain. They had these other fellows that were gun-ho, that were the colonels and the lieutenant colonels and things of that nature. And so I was, I was barely there. An interesting story later would be to talk about that, because I went back to my 50th reunion last year, and many of these fellows who were in ROTC were back at that point. But that's, again, another story for another time.
Cadet Captain Brown graduated from Florida A&M in 1960?
Right.
And then you went in the United States Army?
I went in the Army 10 months later,
Okay.
and I graduated in August 60, and then went in June 61.
What did you do in that 10-month period?
Good question. During that time, I sold insurance. I taught geography at Carver High School.
Carver High School in Memphis.
Right. I tried to sell real estate and never sold a house. And I realize now why I never sold a house, because when you're 21, you don't really know what a house is. All you do as a kid is you live in a house. So, explaining to a potential buyer about the kitchen and the value of a kitchen. So I didn't sell any houses, though I got my real estate license.
You had, at this time, your long-range plan was to go to law school.
Long-range plan to go to law school.
But you obviously had your military duty coming up.
Right.
So, okay.
Right.
And so tell us about your what years were you in the Army?
61 to August 64.
And where were you stationed?
I was stationed mainly in Germany.
Really?
In southern Germany. I might add, Bill, that is probably the defining period of my life.
Yeah. Now that's interesting.
Right.
Your years in the military
service, yeah.
in Germany were the defining.
Yeah.
How was that the defining period of your life, Judge?
I left in June 61, a segregated country, and traveled to Germany. And then several days later, I am the platoon leader of men of all stripes, all colors, all religion. I am in a battalion as an officer where I was the only African American, and had not received any diversity training or any other training of that nature. I was thrown from a segregated environment. I had traveled from, if you can understand, from Memphis up to the East Coast to get a plane to go there, and then several days later, in the fall of the year, you're in a foreign country, in figuratively a foreign environment. And 3 years later, I leave there, coming back to Washington, coming back to the U.S. after the Equal Accommodations Law had been passed. So during that period of time, that 3-year period, I saw the world through different lens. I I guess I said had to, that was being a Freudian slip. Well, I had to adjust to an environment or a milieu that I had not been prepared for. I had been prepared for. I didn't know that I was prepared for. And the reason I changed that because I did well and thrived in that environment. I got good efficiency reports as an officer. I learned a lot about people during that period of time. I developed my leadership skills during that period of time. I learned that the world was more than what I thought it was. I learned how much I had not been taught about World War II, Nazi Germany, all of that, though I was a history minor, I learned that I knew virtually nothing that had gone on in Germany during that period of time. I learned about food. I learned about wine. I learned the value of travel. I learned how different people are, but at the same time, how same, what an extraordinary similarity there is among people. And I learned that I was just as good as any other human being, no matter the color of his or her skin. So I came back from that experience, not being intimidated by people of color, not feeling any less worth of anybody of a different race or nationality, because I had competed, I had socialized with peoples of various races or nationalities. So when I came back to the U.S., I came back with a different view of the world than I left.
It's interesting. You were going through this defining moment in your life at the same time that the civil rights movement continued to progress back home. The first legislation in the 60s in civil rights legislation.
You
Well, not the
absolutely-
first.
All of that was occurring back in the States while I was there. And it was interesting. I mean, as I get back to Diama's book, I was reading about all of what he was going through during that period of time while I was there. You're absolutely right. When I left the U.S., between here and Washington, I knew there was one hotel in Bristol, Tennessee, Virginia, that I could stay overnight.
Really? And that was it?
Right. Now, when I came back, the Equal Accommodations Act had passed. I think it passed in 61, I think it was. No, not 61, 63, I think it was. I mean, not 61. But my point is, when I came back and made the trip from the East Coast back to Memphis, it was a different trip.
You were a different person?
I was a different person, and the environment in the U.S. was different.
Did you consider continuing a career in the military?
Good question. The answer is yes.
Tell us about that.
I was enjoying the military. I was getting good efficiency reports. However, I was in the Signal Corps, and the best thing I knew to do was to put a light bulb,
Tell us what the Signal Corps is.
Well, you laid wire so that for communications. At that time, it was telephone communications and things of that nature. And then I discovered that most of the people who were doing well in the Signal Corps were people who were electrical engineering majors. And here I am as a political science major. And so I didn't think that, I thought that I would be staying in that situation with two strikes against me. But again, it was only one of these, you might say, a flirtation for a few moments, and then I would get back to law. One time I thought I wanted to go into advertising or something like that, a PR, but always I'd go back to law. And at the end of the day, I remember that I was out on bivouac, and it was about 5 degrees, and I'm in a Jeep, and though I always wanted a convertible, I didn't necessarily want one with the temperature being 5 degrees and snow on the ground. And I concluded, I said, I think it's about time for me to make a serious decision. And so at that time, I started making efforts to get enrolled in law school. Eventually, I was able to get out of the Army 2 or 3 months early so that I could enroll in law school in September '64.
So you were discharged from the Army in 1964?
Yes.
Did you remain in the reserves?
Yes, I did. I
How
was in the
long?
reserves while in law school for about 3 years.
Tell us about your, first of all, let's talk about the process of applying to law school. Had you decided while you were in the Army, even before then, where you would like to attend law school?
I think while in the Army, for some reason, I decided I wanted to go to Rutgers. And I don't know why, other than the fact that when I was in college, I would work up in New Jersey, Atlantic City quite a bit, and so I had some affinity for the state of New Jersey. I knew it was a good school, and I applied first to Rutgers, and I was not accepted there, and I'm glad I wasn't. And at the same time, I applied to Howard University and was accepted then.
In Washington, D.C.?
Yes. An interesting note, at that time, I did not know that I had an option to apply at the then Memphis State University.
Now the University of Memphis.
Right. Now, during the period of time that I was in the Army, they had integrated, desegregated the law school here in Memphis. However, I did not know that. And so that was not a consideration for me at that time, probably because I did not know that that school had desegregated.
You think you might have pursued that option, or do you, if
Well, I'm
you'd known
sure
about
I
it?
would have considered it. But under the circumstances, it was not a consideration.
Where'd you take you're in Germany, where did you take the LSAT?
I think I took the LSAT before I went to Germany.
I see, when you were...
Right. I do recall taking the LSAT my senior year at Florida A&M. And I don't recall ever taking it again. That's a good question, but I don't recall ever taking it again. So apparently that LSAT score was sufficient to be used for application.
Why don't we take a short break?
Okay.
Thank you, because we're about to go into New
York. Bill, one fun experience, and now it's fun for me to talk about. While I was in high school and playing music, we were playing at the Foot Home Auditorium. And I remember
Foot Home is a
housing project, but
in
they had sort of like a community room where they would have dances. And on this particular gig, I was playing piano, and the police came in, and the police came over and one said, "Boy, play me a blues." I said, "Yes, sir."
White police officer?
Yeah. And then I would say, "Well, play me a boogie." I said, "Yes, sir." So I said, "Now, I'm going to play you a blues in this hand, and then I'm going to play you a boogie in this hand." And so this is the way I appease. If you know something about music, those were conflicting requests, because a boogie is pretty fast and a blues is slow. And so I said, "Okay, you check this hand out," and then I tell the other one to check this hand out. And I don't know why, I just remember that stir, the police officers coming in and making, I guess, a demand on us, and we figure out a creative way to satisfy their demands.
So you responded to both demands with grace and some humor.
Yeah, right. But I don't know why, after so many years, I just remember that, you know.
All right, we'll take a short break.
Yeah.
Judge, before we talk about your law school era at Howard University. I want to go back and just cover one other area about your experience in Germany. You mentioned earlier that you said you did not read a lot when you were in high school, but you said that particularly when you came out of college, you began to read.
Correct.
Was that during your time in the military?
I think mainly during that time. I think I had a lot of time, a lot more time while in the military. And as a result of that, I started reading. Probably had an interest but the time allowed me to pursue that interest. And also, I remember my wife did a lot of reading. She was an English major. So she came to Germany to join me, and between the two of us, we did a lot of reading. And you got to remember that the winters there get pretty demanding, and so we had a lot of time to entertain ourselves and each other, and much of it was done by reading and listening to a lot of music.
When did you marry?
In August '61, right after I had gone into the military, but 2 months before I was called to go to Germany.
Mm-hmm. Your wife?
My wife at that time was Margaret.
And where was Margaret from?
She was from Savannah, Georgia, and I met her at Florida A&M University.
And she came, you married, and she joined you in Europe during the military?
Right. She joined me in the spring of '62, I think it was.
Back to the reading, was there any books in particular that you read during that time period that really had an impact on you?
I remember one book I picked up was The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And obviously that was about Germany pre and during World War II. I remember reading that book, and it made a searing impression on me because while I had been a history minor in college, a lot of what was contained in that book I simply did not know, did not remember, or had little appreciation of. It made an impact on me.
You mentioned earlier that before this experience you really didn't have a real appreciation and understanding of what had happened during the Second World War.
Correct.
And was this book part of that education?
Exactly. The book was a part of that education, as well as my travels throughout Germany, a part of that education. While I was there, I was able to go all over Germany and was able to visit the concentration camps, Dachau, which made quite an impression on me. I was also able to go to East Berlin, though that was not really, East Berlin and the division of East Berlin and West Berlin was a result of the negotiations after the Second World War. I was able to read and see a lot of history during that period of time. Read as well as see it.
And what was the impact this had on you?
Well, Germany was then and is now a highly industrialized country. To see that what had happened during World War II could happen in a so-called industrialized, highly educated country, I wouldn't say it confused me, but it caused me to pause and probably reflect on just a lot of things that, but for having read, but for having been in Germany, but for having gone to Dachau, I would not have an appreciation of that. I've talked to people who talk about what had happened during that period of time, who have a more cavalier attitude about the experiences of Jews and extermination of Jews. And I say to them, if you walk a mile in my shoes, you would not you would view it differently. A lot of things I've discovered you just gotta really see and experience in order for the impact to, in order for it to make the real impact on you. I had the same experience when I went to, we just fast forwarding, when I went to South Africa. The word apartheid, in my opinion, up until I went to South Africa, was a South African word for segregation, in my opinion. On the other hand, when I went there, and I went there during a period of time that they were having the conciliation hearings, I learned that the experiences were much more insidious, much more violent than I had an appreciation of. And I don't think I would have had this appreciation but for being able to experience some of that, at least firsthand, to be on the soil of that particular country to see and experience and look.
When did you make that visit to South Africa?
Made that visit maybe about 13 years ago. It was really 2 years after the end of apartheid. I think in the late 90s. But those observations have left indelible impressions on me.
You're discharged from the Army in
August 64.
August 64, and you start
September at Howard University.
All right. Now, Howard University is one of the foremost law schools in the country, a great tradition with training African-American lawyers and judges and educators. Tell me about the experience at Howard.
I came back to the States and to Washington, the father of a child. My daughter was born in Germany. My wife, Loretta, and I moved to Washington, D.C., so we had to find a place to stay and all of that. I found Howard, first of all, I noticed that there was a significant percentage of females in law school that somehow I didn't, I guess I never thought about it, but in my class, in excess of a third of the enrollees in the freshman class were female.
And this was in 1966.
64.
Excuse me, 64.
Right.
At that time,
right.
Was that unusual for law schools?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you got to realize I'm new to law school, and I've been over trying to defend our country. But I noticed. I mean, that was one thing that I noticed. There were a goodly number of white applicants in my freshman class. So it was a diverse freshman class. I guess I never thought about it, but I was struck by the diversity of that class in 64, September 64. That's number one. Number two, as you indicated, the school has always been involved in the legal aspects of the civil rights movement, the legal aspects of African Americans' quest for freedom, justice, and equality. And so many of the professors there were involved or had been involved in those kinds of activities by being a part of the Legal Defense Fund or being part of some defense team. And so there was that kind of environment at Howard University Law School. It was probably the first time that I think I found myself in the presence of true African American intellectuals, of true African American legal giants. Mm-hmm. So it was an inspiring environment.
Were there any particular professors that you remember that inspired you at Howard?
Well, I was impressed. I remember Clarence Clyde Ferguson, who was a distinguished professor, Patricia Harris, who later became an ambassador, I think, to Luxembourg, and was active in, I think, it was the Johnson administration. Was one of my professors. I think she taught torts. There are two other names that I would call that people may or may not know: Herbert O'Reed and Gina Sparks. There were just a host of individuals that would what you would call storied individuals in the legal profession, particularly with regard to certain legal cases involving civil rights.
And you were in our nation's capital.
Right.
During, again, a historic time in the history of our country. Did you feel like you were kind of at the epicenter there of what was going on?
Well, at the time I didn't. I think at the time I was there to do one thing, and that was to get an education and to finish in 3 years and come back to Memphis to practice law. Having reflected on that, the answer to that question is absolutely, because in the summertime I would work somewhere downtown in one of the government agencies, and
in downtown Washington.
Yes,
yes, sir.
Right, and people would come to the law school if there was any legal matter. You know, they would. These lawyers would come to Howard University. I remember H.T. Lockard coming to Howard University while I was
Lockard,
there. Judge H.T. Lockard, retired Judge H.T.
from Memphis,
Lockard.
Tennessee.
Yes,
yeah.
Right. So in reading the Washington Post and being in the nation's capital, you'd have to be blind, deaf and dumb not to be affected by all of that which was going on at that time. And that was during the time of the Johnson administration. Kennedy was assassinated while I was in Germany. So when I came back, Lyndon Johnson was the president, and as history has recorded, a lot of civil rights activity and legislation was passed during the Johnson administration, which was also during the period of time that I was in Washington in law school.
And at the same time, you're starting to raise a family.
Yes.
Your children, tell me your children's names.
Loretta and Hank. Loretta was born in Germany, I think, in 1963. Mm-hmm. So she was a toddler. And by the time I finished law school, I had a second child.
And what did your wife do when you were in law school?
She supported us by teaching in the D.C. public schools.
So it must have been pretty demanding on y'all you're in law school with all the demands of law school, but you have two small children there as well.
I guess somehow you make it, you don't need much money. And I was involved in, I was in the reserves. I was in the Army Reserves. And I think during some of those years, I might have gotten a GI Bill. So I was, you add a little bit here, and you add a little bit here, and you add a little bit here, and you really don't need that much, and somehow you make it.
Where'd y'all live?
Lived in Northwest Washington in an apartment. When we first got there, Margaret had a sister there who still lives there. We lived with them for maybe a couple of 3 months until we were able to find a place in Washington. We stayed in an apartment in Northwest Washington, right off of North Capitol.
Now, obviously, between your law studies and being in the reserves and your family, a lot of demands on your law school time. Even with that, were there any activities you were involved in law school?
No, I went to law school to get an education. That's it. I think it was the first time that I was serious as a student. I was married, I had a family, and I had a goal. And I never went to a football game, basketball game. I consider myself going to work.
It was a job.
Yes, right. It was a job of getting a degree.
You got your degree from Howard in 1967.
67, right.
And you came home to Memphis.
Came to Memphis.
Now, as a fellow Memphian, I want to ask you about that because my impression is, from what you said earlier, that you always planned to come back to Memphis. Is that correct?
I always wanted to come to Memphis.
And why is that?
I don't know. Other than one, it's home. Two, I wanted to practice law. That's about it. Obviously, I had been in Washington for 3 years. Many of my classmates were going to stay in Washington, either to find employment with the federal government or do otherwise. I never considered that.
You were always focused on going back to Memphis.
I was always focused on coming back to Memphis. For whatever reason, the answer to that is yes.
1967.
Right.
You come back to Memphis.
Right.
Take the bar.
Took the bar.
And where'd you start your law practice?
Well, let's talk about taking the bar.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Because at that time, I couldn't get in bar review school.
Really? Uh-huh.
I didn't know about a bar review school.
The bar review school being a course to prepare you
A course
for
to
taking
prepare
the bar
you to
exam.
take the bar exam. About 4 or 5 of us banded or bonded together to study for the bar. One being Otis Higgs. I met him upon returning back to Memphis.
Otis Higgs
Yeah.
became a judge himself,
Yes, right.
Judge Otis Higgs.
So Otis and I and 2 other persons studied together for the bar. One thing I had learned, someone had told me the importance of reading the advance sheets. And during my second semester of my senior year, I started religiously reading the advance sheets from Tennessee, and then I also got a couple of sets of old bar exams. And so with the advance sheets and bar exams, I studied my second semester, came back and studied that summer with Otis and 2 others. One was Laverne Tisdale. I think she's since passed away. 4 or 5 of us studied together to get ready for the bar exam.
How did those study groups work? Was somebody a mentor? Or did you bring in somebody, or did you?
I think Mr. Ladding helped us a bit.
Mr. Ladding, the lawyer
Yeah. Right.
first lawyer you ever met, I guess, that
Right.
inspired you.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Where'd y'all have your study group? I'm just curious.
Mainly at his office.
Really?
Yeah, right. He had some office space, and we would study there.
Where was his office located?
On Wellington, near Westcroft Boulevard. That's Danny Thomas Boulevard now. Yeah.
Close to downtown.
Yes.
South.
Right.
South,
but not
south
downtown. Yes.
It's just south of downtown. Memphis.
Correct.
Yeah. So you took the bar exam, in the summer of 1967?
Took the bar exam in summer of 1967 and passed it. In retrospect, I think about that because I had this idea of saying when I would pass. I never thought about if I would pass. That was probably a little presumptuous or arrogance on my part, but I just worked hard and thought I'd pass it. So I did.
And at that point, where'd you start your practice?
With A.A. Ladding.
A.A. Ladding, okay. So this is the lawyer you had known since you were a boy,
Right.
So you were.
I started and associated with him there on Wellington.
And how many lawyers were there in the firm?
It wasn't a firm. It was Mr. Ladding's office, and I was an associate. But there were the grand total of the 2 of us there.
So you and Mr. Ladding.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And what was your, if you don't mind my asking, what was your pay?
My pay was whatever I could bring in and rustle, and you might have heard, Bill. You eat what you kill. Mm-hmm. I ate what I killed. Well, I ate, even though I didn't kill much.
How long did you practice with Mr. Ladding?
I think I stayed with him about 1.5 years, maybe close to 2 years, and then I had an opportunity to go with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Yeah. I want to talk about that in just a second.
Yeah.
But Mr. Ladding, what basically, what sort of practice did Mr. Ladding have?
He had mainly a civil practice. And
As a trial lawyer?
As a trial lawyer, and just a general practice. He did everything, but did not do very much criminal work. I don't recall a criminal trial that he had during the time I was there. He had a great deal of activity in Chancery Court. He did a significant Chancery practice and practice in Circuit Court, and he had a good bit of probate work during that period of time. So 90% of my time was spent on the civil side with him. And I learned to practice law with him.
So you, your first trials, you were Mr. Ladding's co-counsel, associate?
I wouldn't say co-counsel. I was the person that carried the briefcase.
You remember your first client?
You know, I don't remember that. I should remember that, but I don't remember that.
Do you remember one of your first clients, early client?
I remember, I don't remember one of my first clients. I remember a potential client. A person came to me to draw up a corporate papers. They wanted to go into the air conditioning business, and I suggested to them that perhaps I would serve them better if they would retain me to give them advice generally on their business venture and business activity, rather than to spend all of the money drawing up corporate papers, since it appeared that they didn't need the corporate papers to protect anything or things of that nature. The client decided to go and get another lawyer, and I think I was quite disappointed about that. And I remember asking Mr. Ladding about it and sharing that story with him, and asking him his advice whether or not I had handled that situation as he would have.
What was his response?
His response was, "Did you give the client your best advice?" And that dialogue has remained with me, and I told him that I felt that I had. And he indicated that if you do that each and every time, that you would do all right in this profession, and that I should not feel bad about that individual going and getting someone else if I gave the client my best and well-considered advice. And I've stayed with that. I've stayed with that all my professional career. And in fact, in a mediation recently, I had the occasion to say that we are not mechanics. You know, you don't come to lawyers and say, "Change my brakes." If you go to a mechanic and say, "Change my brakes," and you say, "Oh, incidentally, I found out that your engine needs re-overhauled, and I did that too," well, the mechanic has gone beyond his or her responsibilities. On the other hand, if one comes to a professional, a lawyer, a physician, implicit in coming to that person, that professional, saying, "Tell me what I ought to do. Give me some advice," rather than you're saying, "Fix this, fix that," end of discussion. So that experience has stayed with me.
You practiced for
Yeah.
Mr. Ladding,
Right.
for a year and a half.
Yes.
You say? And then you had a chance to go with the EOC.
Yes, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Tell us about when you went to work for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and what you did.
I was first an investigator, and I quickly became a conciliator, which is sort of a precursor of being a negotiator with our portfolio. So I was there probably a couple of years.
Was this in Memphis?
In Memphis.
Okay.
Right. And so I enjoyed that. I rose up to be the second in command in the Memphis office. I concluded that in order to move up in that organization, I was going to have to move out of Memphis, and I didn't want to do that.
The work of the EOC is to do what?
Is investigating employment discrimination complaints. Their jurisdiction now has become much broader than it was then in the late 60s. But that was the purpose of that commission.
When you said you were, was the term, I'm sorry, conciliator?
Conciliator, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you function much like, it was really a negotiation process wherein you really did not have power, but the goal was to cause the respondent, generally a company, and the complainant, generally an individual, to see if you could cause those two to reach some accord short of they're going to court or going to litigate their matter. And the conciliator acted as a neutral, if you will, between those two parties to try to see if you could cause them to reach some accord.
Now I have to fast forward just briefly,
Yeah.
and we'll come back. But of course, your work now, after you've retired as a judge, is in mediation.
Is in mediation.
And mediating primarily what types of matters?
I do a great deal of nursing home negligence, medical malpractice, and the rest just generally tort issues for the most part. Some other issues that are just, I would put in the other category, but mainly in those areas, as well as what I call red light, green light matters. I don't do a great deal of family law matters, except where there are some extreme circumstances and certain lawyers think that maybe my judicial background may assist in those matters.
Did you ever envision when you were a young lawyer with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission doing conciliation work that someday your practice might focus on mediation and negotiation and trying to resolve conflicts?
Bill, at that time, I don't think that nobody knew about words like ADR or
Alternative dispute resolution.
You're right. Mediation, that was not on the horizon at that time. They didn't teach that in law school. We didn't do that much as lawyers then. So the answer to that question is absolutely not.
How long were you with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission?
I think about 2.5 years.
And you mentioned earlier that you had an opportunity to continue your career there, but that would have involved leaving your hometown.
Right.
Going to Washington or where?
Either Washington, they had district offices in other places, Atlanta, Cleveland, or other places where the offices were larger and the opportunity to get government rank was higher than what was available here in Memphis.
So rather than continue with the EEOC, where did your career go at that point?
Well, Bill, my career has been interesting. Every time that I can't think of a time that I made a move that somebody didn't call me, an invitation or an opportunity was presented to me. I cannot recall a time that I, on my own volition, went out to seek making another move. It's interesting for me to say that. While I was at the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I had an occasion to have a matter involving Mayor Myers Paper Company. Mayor Myers Paper Company at that time was represented by a lawyer that you know well, Irvin Begotten. And I was the conciliator in a case involving Mayor Myers Paper Company.
That company was company in Memphis.
Company in Memphis, correct, that he represented. So I met Irving in that conciliation, and I think that each of us made a good impression on the other. Number two, at some point I went to a bar function and sat next to a lawyer by the name of John Walt, who was at that time very active in Leader Federal Loan and Savings Association. It's no longer in Memphis. But anyway, each of those events had no significance at the time. But later on, Mr. Begarden and John Walt contacted me and asked would I consider being the director of the Legal Services Association. And at that time, the Legal Services Association did not exist. Mike Cody and others were assisting indigent people out of Centenary Methodist Church in South Memphis. Begarden and Walt and others in the bar were attempting to establish Legal Services Association.
This would have been around 1960?
No, this is about 71.
About 71 by
Yeah,
that
about seven.
time. Okay.
Maybe 67, 69, about 71, 72, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they contacted me about that. As an aside, A.C. Warden always says that he and I were riding around town when they had made the announcement that Memphis had been awarded a certain amount of money for a legal services program. And as AC remembers it, that I told him that anybody that takes that job would be a damn fool. And so...
And you both ended up taking it.
I was the first fool and he was the second fool, at least based on what he says. But anyway...
He's now, I think most of our listeners know this, but he's now the mayor.
He's now the mayor of
Memphis.
But anyway, I was the first director. That is how Irvin Begarden and John Walt approached me to consider becoming the first director of Legal Services, and I accepted that position. That is why and how I moved from EEOC to Legal Services.
Now, 40 years later, Legal Services is an established part of the bar.
That's correct.
But you're there at Genesis chapter 1.
Absolutely.
First of all, where were the first offices of was it called Memphis Area Legal Services or just Memphis Area Legal Services?
Memphis Area Legal Services Association at that time.
And where were your first offices?
Well, I was given a portfolio. I was given a manila folder of rejected applicants to be executive directors. The first offices were in the Ten Oak building.
Ten Oak building. Mm-hmm.
No, not in the Ten Oak building. The first offices were in the Durman building.
Durman building in downtown Memphis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, on 3rd.
On 3rd Street.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right. That was the first offices. Mm-hmm. Then we opened offices in South Memphis on South Parkway at an old bowling alley. And then the third office was open on Thomas Street near Chelsea Avenue. So during my period as director, we opened 3 offices.
How many did you have on your staff when you opened your doors?
When we opened the doors? I think it was one person. I might have hired Lee Miller. He was the deputy director. Probably there were 2 of us.
What was the reaction of the established bar in those days?
The reaction, the bar was not. The bar was highly skeptical. The bar association felt that the program would take business from private lawyers. So it was not a welcoming climate at that particular time for legal services. We had even on the board of the Legal Services Association, I think it's fair to say that some of the people on that board had been selected by the Bar Association to make sure that you keep those folk in check, So it was not like it is now where everybody on the board is embracing and buys into the whole philosophy of legal services. So it was a very I wouldn't say hostile climate, but it was not the friendliest climate.
So how'd you deal with that challenge?
Well, I think the 3 years in Germany and all of that prepared me for all this kind of stuff. I mean, by the time I got to that challenge, I wouldn't say it was a walk in the park, but it was simply another challenge. And I think that's significant because at that point, having had the experiences that I had, I was not intimidated by lawyers. I was not intimidated by judges. I left my intimidations and all of that kind of stuff somewhere in Germany. And I was probably sufficiently politically savvy to know what I had to do on behalf of the program. A couple of things I did, Bill. In taking over, I let the board know that I did not have the authority to encroach upon the way and the manner in which the individual lawyers would represent their clients. And I consider that a strategic move because I thought at some point that issue was going to come back on the table. So that was one of the main things that I did. The second thing that I did, and I'm ambivalent about that, I decided not to go to court myself so that I would not have to run interference and deal with the judges as a practicing lawyer, that I would be the director of the program, much like an executive rather than be a lawyer too. Mm. So those were two decisions that I made. And the third, I think, was to develop a very good working relationship with certain members of the bar that I felt would assist the program. One was Irvin Bogartin in particular. Another one, and it was John Walt. John Walt was much more, shall we say, conservative than Irvin Bogartin, but just a solid individual. Mm-hmm. And he had a relationship with a certain element of the bar that I would say that Bogartin did not have. So I developed a good relationship with John Walt. I think John Walt, during a number of those years, was probably the chairman of the board. And of course, we had Mike Cody and Ron Barad and others like that. I mean, they were, you knew you could count on them. But these others, I developed that. Irvin Bogartin had a good relationship with Dan Kirkendall, who was our congressman at that time. Dan Kirkendall was not in favor of legal services, but being the politician that he was, once the program was funded nationally, he was an advocate for a Memphis program getting what its fair share. So I had a good relationship and had an entree there and had an ally there in Kirkendall to assist us in funding and other issues like that. So I was trying to deal with the politics of the program, both locally and nationally, to number one, to make sure we stay viable, and number two, get our money.
How many years did you serve as director?
3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
Which would have been from 19...
I think about 72 or 3 to about 75.
And where was your next, what I guess I should phrase it this way, what you're telling me. Who was the next person who contacted you?
I believe at that time I might have sat down and had a talk with myself.
Okay.
And decided that it was time to go out on my own and practice law. And I talked with Walt Evans,
Walter Evans, who's now Chancellor Walter
Chancellor
Evans.
Walter Evans. And he and I, he was in law school a year behind me at Howard, and we had kept in contact. And we talked for a while, for quite a while, and decided to plan to open a law firm.
We can take a break. So you and now Chancellor Evans, when did you open your law firm?
I believe that was at around 74, 75. I'm not good on specific dates.
And tell me about the practice when you went into private practice.
Well, we were inspired by a number of developing African-American firms in Atlanta, in Detroit, in other areas of the country, but there was nothing like that in Memphis. And we decided that we wanted to have a true law firm. So we had a partnership that was a law firm in the truest sense of the word, Brown and Evans. And we spent time developing an image. We spent time and money in terms of stationery, getting offices decorated so that we would be able to present a new and different brand to Memphis than that had occurred before, particularly for African-American lawyers.
So prior to the advent of Brown and Evans, there had been lawyers like Mr. Latting. There had been prominent attorneys, but in terms of a firm comprised of African-American attorneys, that was something new?
That was new.
Did you, you and Chancellor Evans, were you all the first two partners?
Yes.
And did you hire associates?
We did.
Who did you hire?
Judge John Donald.
Judge Donald, now currently a
Right.
judge?
While she was not an associate, while I was there, Judge Rita Stotts came through that firm.
Like Judge Stotts. Mhm.
Again, while she was not an associate while I was there, Judge Bernice Dorsey. But one notable, but John Donald was an associate while Walter and I were together, as well as Larry Brown. I'm sure you know
Yes.
Robert Larry Brown. Very outstanding lawyer who is recently retired from FedEx. So Larry Brown was an associate in our firm also, as well as Kevin Willis.
Okay.
There may be some others that I'm not remembering right now.
But you've mentioned at least four, counting you and Chancellor Evans and Judge Donald and Judge Doris Hunt and
Stotts.
Judge Rita Stotts.
Yeah.
Y'all were kind of a training ground for future
In
Memphis
retrospect,
judges.
yes.
Yeah. How long did you work with Brown and Evans? Or did you run Brown and Evans, I should say?
Well, along with Walter, the two of us together, until about 1980.
I have to ask you about politics during this time too, because you told me you'd done a pretty good job as a student at Florida A&M over the years at avoiding elective politics. But at some point, you decided to run for office in Memphis.
I decided to run for office the first time in '68, and I probably didn't tell you this, and I probably forgot about it. I ran as an independent for state representative. It was at a time when I think A.W. Willis was defeated by James I. Taylor back in either '68 or '69, so I was young. And
A.W. Willis was
an outstanding lawyer, civil rights leader. He was a legislator, and he was defeated by, I guess, what I would call a maverick, someone who, well, he was defeated, and he shouldn't have been defeated, and I decided to run as an independent, and you know how that is. That doesn't generally fare too well, and it didn't. So that was my first foray into politics. My second foray was in politics was the result, again, of an invitation to be an advisor to the Memphis City School Board. After Black Mondays, and let me say just a minute what that was, there was a protest in our community because the school board was all white. And the NAACP and others protested, and the children were staying out on each Monday in order to bring attention to that. The school board agreed to select 2 persons to be court advisors to the school board until the legislation could be changed to enlarge the school board. Dr. Hollis Price, who was the president of Lemoyne-Owen at that time, and I were selected to be advisors to the school board. That was about 69, and then in 71, the law had changed so that the composition of the board would be a larger 9 people, and that time I ran for office to be on the school board. So I think that was in 71. That was my second time to run for office, my first time that I was in elective office.
And did you run again as an independent?
Oh, on the school board was nonpartisan.
Yeah, nonpartisan
Yeah,
elections
right,
to
right,
school board.
Right.
And how long did you serve on the school board?
I served on the school board 13 years. Interesting enough, my school board tenure and part of my judicial tenure overlaps, but I was on the school board 13 years.
Now, that must have been, it's an understatement to say that's an interesting assignment, being on the Board of Education.
That was an understatement. That's an understatement.
During again, an
During
interesting...
busing in there.
During the...
That was quite a conflict during that period of time. There was quite an interest in what was happening in the schools at that time because we were still going through desegregation plans, busing and the whole bit.
And about the same time that the orders on busing were issued, a number of private schools began to emerge,
yeah.
and there was some white flight from the public schools into the private schools.
Right.
Where were your kids at that time?
They were in public schools at Snowden, I think, Valentine and Snowden, in the Valentine-Snowden area.
It's in Midtown, Memphis.
Yeah, right. My children went to Valentine, Snowden, and then my daughter eventually went to Central High School, and my son eventually went to Snowden High School. Not Overton High School, I'm sorry.
I believe you mentioned earlier your daughter is
Loretta.
Loretta,
Yes.
and your son is
Hank.
Hank.
He's
Okay.
George Brown III.
There you go.
So.
Again, you've lived through some years of change in Memphis, and those years on the school board. What did you learn from that experience, and how did it impact the rest of your career?
One thing on the school board, though there were 9 different personalities, the board was 6 white, 3 African American. During that period of time, the political philosophies were all over the spectrum. In retrospect, I'm struck by the collegiality that existed among the people there, even though there was so much divergent feelings and opinions. There was a reasonable degree of cordiality in spite of the fact that there were strongly held opinions on certain issues, like busing and what have you. So what did I learn? I think that most of the people there, though they differed, in my opinion, were committed to public education. I'm not sure that I feel the same way now that when I see some of the public bodies. I sense that certain people on these bodies now have hidden agendas. The other thing is that there was not, at that time, the school board was not viewed as a stepping stone to another higher office at that particular time.
It truly was to serve the public schools.
Yes, yeah. And during that period of time, Bill, I got involved in national school board issues. In other words, as the president of the board, I at some point held a national office in some of the national school board associations. My reflection is that there was a genuine interest in education and public education among those that both served here in Memphis, as well as many that I met around the country.
And you were on the school board what years?
Oh, about 71, I think, to 83 or 82 or something.
And you served as president of the school board during...
So I don't, probably one or two of those terms, yeah.
Then, at some point, you get another call.
Yes, I did.
And I think this may have been from the governor's office.
Well, it was indirectly from the governor's office.
All right, tell us about your, tell us about the call that came that resulted in you starting your career in the judiciary.
Well, that's a good question. I got a call from Bill Gibbons.
Bill Gibbons, who's now the district attorney,
Who's district
Shelby
attorney.
County.
Bill Gibbons and I were then and are now friends. Let me back up a little bit. I had been involved in Governor Alexander's campaign prior to this call. And during that period of time, became quite acquainted with Bill Gibbons.
Was this during Governor Alexander's first campaign for governor in
No.
74 or the second campaign?
Second campaign.
78?
Yes, not the first.
Okay.
So I get a call from Bill saying, he said, I want to have dinner with you, which was kind of a little different. I don't know whether we had dinner before. And so we met at Grisani's, who's no longer exists, was on Airways at that time.
Famous Italian restaurant.
Exactly.
Big John Grisani.
Big John Grisani.
Big
right,
John
yeah.
Grisani's restaurant.
So we met at that restaurant, and then we engaged in small talk, and Bill says, Lamar wants to appoint you to the state Supreme Court.
Governor Alexander.
And so I said, well, what makes him think that I could do a good job at that? And Bill says, well, you couldn't do any worse than some that we've had. Or something of that nature. So then it has to take a while to have all of that soak in terms of what has been said and the whole import of that.
Did you have any indication that when you went to Grisani's with now General Gibbons that was being considered?
I had no indication. I had no aspiration of being in the judiciary. I never thought of being in the judiciary at all.
Even when you were young, when you were a child and you were dreaming of being a lawyer, you weren't dreaming of being a judge?
I never dreamed of being a judge. I mean, I wanted to be a lawyer, a lawyer. So in terms of ambitions, desires, expectations, whatever word you want to use, no.
You said you were involved in Governor Alexander's campaign for governor in 70. Where had you met Governor Alexander?
Good question. I met him during the 74 campaign. We met, he came to Memphis. Bob Schroeder arranged a meeting for several African Americans. I think it was Walter Bailey, Otis Higgs. I don't know whether Diami was there. I know Walter, Otis, I was there, maybe some others. And we met, I don't remember where we met. We met and Lamar Alexander was introduced, and he was running for governor at that time. I know I was on the school board, and I met him at that particular time. I was impressed with him. We had what I consider to be some frank conversations about his aspirations as an individual and mine. He's a lawyer, as you well know, and he's about a year younger than I am. So there were some commonalities there. And I remember telling him, I'm interested only in good government. You write on a sheet of paper what you're interested in life and what you want out of life. And once you write it, all you got to do is cross your name out and put my name on it. My interest is the same. You know, I said, I'm not looking for a job. I'm just looking for, you know, good government, somebody I can be proud of.
Was he aware of the fact that you were a piano player, as he is?
I don't think so. No, I didn't. I wasn't. No, I think the answer to that is no. And I wasn't aware that he was a piano player either.
Okay. All right.
I later learned he's quite a piano player. But anyway, we met, and I will say that I felt a positive vibe when I met him in '74. I declined to get involved in his campaign. I looked at the numbers. For whatever reason, I declined. But I thought well of him then. In '78, prior to that campaign, I saw that he was coming to Memphis. I invited him to come by our law firm. We were having a Christmas party. I said, if you have time, why don't you come by? And so that was prior to the '78 campaign. I was asked to be involved in that campaign. Then I went to my father and talked to him and said, well, you know, I met this guy, and, you know, he's a Republican and this, that, and the other. I said, but I feel, you know, I feel an admiration for him, and you know, what do you think? He wants me to be involved in his campaign. And I think my father said, well, you know, if you respect him as a man, and you do what you think you ought to do. Anyway, in that campaign, I became involved in that campaign.
Had you been involved in Republican politics prior to that time?
I wasn't involved in politics at that time, period, other than school board.
Now those, go ahead and interrupt you.
Right, so no, I wasn't involved in politics at that time, and I haven't been involved in politics since that time, and let me explain that. I didn't then consider myself aligned to a party, nor do I consider myself aligned to a party now. I just haven't found it compelling to commit to a political party. I commit to the individuals, but not to a political party. So I was committed to and impressed with then Governor Alexander and supported him during that period of time. And to answer a question you haven't asked, I've supported him without any expectations of anything personally. I just thought that he deserved support by what he stood for and by the content of his character. So that probably said more than you.
No. Well, you know, now, those of us who love Memphis and love the history of Memphis and study the history of Memphis know that at one time, the leadership of the Republican Party in Memphis was African American, taking back to Lieutenant Lee.
Lieutenant Lee.
But by this time, by 1978, I assume most of the African American community was involved in the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. Did that create any issues for you, or? Well,
I had difficulty with that, and the reason I had difficulty with that is because I knew the legislative record of Ray Blanton, who Alexander ran against, and there was nothing in his record that suggested to me that 90% of the African Americans should be behind Ray Blanton, given his record in Congress. So I had difficulty intellectually understanding why everybody was lining up behind this guy. That's with regard to Blanton. Then you fast forward 4 years, and Jake Butcher was running. And I think I can tell you this story. I met Jake Butcher in the airport with Alvin King.
Alvin King, who was a legislator
A
from Memphis.
legislator. Jake Butcher had on a black shirt and a white tie, and let's say he did not look impressive.
Okay.
So I got a bad vibe from what I met. And now, this is all before he had retained an ad agency where he changed to a blue suit, white shirt, and a blue tie, and got his hair all done up right. So the point I'm making is I just had a bad vibe when I met Butcher, and I had 4 years of a good vibe having observed Alexander.
So you supported Governor Alexander in 1978 in his campaign for governor, but with no expectation that you were...
I just had difficulty. I could not see why everybody was lining up with the folk that they were, and I just made my own decision.
Let's take a short break, and I'm mindful, it's about 11:25. Can we go for a little bit? Because we're getting to the interesting part now. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So your friend Bill Gibbons, now General Gibbons, invites you to dinner at Grisani's and gives you news you never expected to hear in your life, which is the governor of Tennessee would like to appoint you to the Tennessee Supreme Court.
Correct.
And your reaction to that was?
I'm not sure even that I even knew enough to even have a reaction. Other than after it soaked in, I think I was shocked and overwhelmed, and so I had to gather my thoughts and say, well, I need to talk to some folk about this.
Who'd you talk to about it?
Sure, I talked to my wife. Sure, I talked to my father. Sure, I talked to my law partner. I know I did that. So I don't know beyond that who I talked to, but I'm sure I talked to all those folk, or whoever else was in the law firm at that particular time.
This was in the pre-Tennessee Day, Tennessee Plan Day, excuse me,
Right.
Where there was not a commission. It was the governor's. Am I correct? It was the governor's appointment to make.
Right. Right.
And your colleagues that you talked with about this, did they encourage you to pursue this?
Yes. I will say that I did not really know all of the ramifications of it at the time. I did not know, and I'm not suggesting that any of that would change my mind. I did not know that I would have to run in about 3 months. I did not know I'd have to run in a partisan race. I didn't take any of that into consideration. I think after having had time to reflect on it, I began to understand the historical import of the invitation and felt that I had to say yes.
Did you know any other Supreme Court justices in Tennessee at the time?
No, I didn't.
None of them.
Well, I did know Justice Fones. I think he was on. Was he on the
Memphis?
phone? I think he was on the bench that time. I think I did know him because he was in the firm with before he became a justice. He was in the Barad firm. Yes.
And Mr. Barad was was on your...
Barad and Bogarden, that whole firm.
Sure.
Yeah.
We're both
Yes.
worked
Right.
with y'all,
Yeah,
worked
right.
with you at Legal
Correct.
Services. So you decided to accept the
Yes. Yes.
invitation, if that's the right word,
Yes.
from the governor to
Yes.
appoint you.
Yes.
And so you were appointed when?
I was appointed in June '80.
June of 1980.
Right.
Okay. And you had to immediately start a campaign for
I had to
your
immediately
re-election?
start a campaign.
Your election.
Right.
And that was in August of...
In August of '80.
And in those days, as you said, we had partisan elections for the Tennessee Supreme Court.
Correct.
So you were nominated by the Republican Party.
And I remember, name escapes me right now. He's been, it's been a fixture in politics here in Nashville. John J. Hooker, I was calling. John J. Hooker, I think at that time was involved in one of the Nashville papers. And he and some others urged the Democrats to nominate me also. But that didn't go.
Was it the Nashville Banner that he?
I think, yeah, he was over there. Yeah, he was involved with the Nashville Banner. But there was a recommendation, a suggestion that the Democrats nominate me also, and but that did not occur.
The nominations, who made the nominations on behalf of the parties in those days?
Well, I think the different parties had different processes. I think in that situation, the nomination had been made by the governor, and so if the party were involved, it was probably perfunctory. On the other hand, I think that the Democrats went through a more involved process to come up with a nomination.
And the Democrats nominated
Frank Dwoda.
Justice Dwoda.
Yes.
And so in the summer of 1980, did you actively campaign for your election?
I did, and he did too, and we spent a lot of time together. We spent a number of nights and evenings in faraway places, just the two of us, campaigning.
Very cordial campaign?
It was.
Between you and Justice
Yes,
Dwoda, I mean.
it was, and he's such a first-rate individual and judge, and had a great record at that particular time. I didn't want to lose, of course, but if I had to be defeated, it seems to me you can accept it much better if the individual is a worthy opponent. And he and I have had a very cordial relationship since that summer of 1980.
We know now that politics has become so expensive, and even in judicial campaigns in states unlike Tennessee that do not have a Missouri or Tennessee plan for appellate judges, that lawyers are known to spend literally millions of dollars to get a seat on the state Supreme Court. Do you remember how much you and your supporters spent in your campaign in 1980?
No, it's not anything close to that. It was probably upper five figures. Mm-hmm. You know, I would imagine, somewhere between maybe $60,000 and $90,000, $60,000 and $100,000. I would imagine, not much more than that. I don't think.
Were there actual issues in the campaign, or was it basically?
Not really. I think one issue might have been whether or not I was qualified, or whether this was a political payoff or something of this nature, but not really, not really issues in the campaign. I did not have a judicial record at that particular point. On the other hand, Frank Dwoda did. So I think fair game would have been the issue of judicial experience between the two of us. And of course, you had that situation here recently on the U.S. Supreme Court. The recent person that was selected had no judicial experience. So if there were an issue, those were issues that were a result of the professional background of the individuals that were appointed or selected. I might add that was an interesting summer because I had to campaign, but at the same time, I was advised to make sure that I did my work on the Supreme Court for those 3 months, and I did. I did my work. I wrote opinions on during that period of time. I was fortunate to have an outstanding law clerk who has since become quite a leader in Tennessee legal activities, Buck Lewis. So I was, in course, as you know, being a practicing lawyer, I just walked out of a law practice at the same time. So I had an extraordinarily busy summer, but I was able to write 2 or 3 opinions and come to the CERT conferences and participate during that period of time, and at the same time campaign. It was a great experience. It was a great summer. I don't think I'd ever want to, relive that summer.
Did you feel like you had the strong support of the Republican Party?
I had the very, very strong support. I crossed the Tennessee River, from east to west, leading by 100,000 votes. I met my Waterloo, if you will, in Middle Tennessee.
So it came strong out of Republican East Tennessee.
That's right.
And then
Right.
You mentioned John J. Hooker trying to get bipartisan support.
Right.
Did you have a lot of bipartisan support from Democrats and independents across the
I had it in West Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
I was not able to get it in Middle Tennessee, and in certain areas, particularly out in Nashville, I was a little disappointed that I thought I would have been able to get more support than I did. But after some time has passed, I realized how well respected Frank DeWoto was in this area. So that explains that.
Having gone through a partisan election for the Tennessee Supreme Court, do you have feelings now about the way we select Supreme Court justices in Tennessee and appellate judges in Tennessee?
I have strong feelings against partisan elections with regard to judges.
And why is that?
The political parties have their own agendas about a lot of things. There are certain activities in our community that do not lend themselves to definition by political parties, and one is the judiciary. You bring a certain set of qualifications, experiences to that office, and they should not, and they don't lend themselves to being defined by some so-called ideology of political parties. I think it adds an irrelevant element into the whole selection process.
Do you feel that way about trial judges, or is your opinion about partisan?
You mean trial judges?
Yes, as well
I
as
feel the
appellate
same way.
judges?
Yes.
So you actually would like to see all judges a merit selection process and retention process.
Now, you asked me earlier about the political.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay, right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what I was speaking about.
I apologize.
That, yeah.
Well, let's talk about being a trial judge.
Okay.
You served for 3 months.
22 years. 3 months on the Supreme Court and 22 years on the trial bench.
And when did the opportunity arise for you? When did you get your next call? Because your life is a series of these meetings,
That was in
calls.
83.
All right.
That was in 1983.
From 1980 to 1983, what did you do?
I practiced law again.
Back with Chancellor
Brown and Evans, yes.
Back with Brown and Evans.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And did the firm grow during that time?
I think we did. However, I think we were probably a few years ahead of our time in terms of some of the things that we wanted to do.
Like what, for example?
Well, as I see many of the firms now, and some or many of the African American lawyers, the kind of law practice, the quality of cases, the quality of clients, that did not exist in the early and mid 80s as it does now. And the ability to get retainers and to be able to count on, I guess what you would say, repetitive quality business that would allow you to specialize. That option just did not exist at that time. I was attempting to develop a an entertainment law practice. And much to my regret, and I did not know it at the time, it was the beginning of the end of Stax Records at the same time that we started our firm.
Stax Records was?
The leading record company in Memphis, and it was a magnet for other record companies and artists. And when I started, I did have a retainer from Stax Records and doing business with them and for them and for artists that were involved. But that industry dried up. We wanted to have a different kind of law practice, not to exclude the usual, but to go after that which historically African American lawyers did not get themselves involved in, that they can do now. When I talk to some of the lawyers now that have been able to develop the firms now.
So how did the call come to go to the trial bench?
Of course, I think at that time everybody knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to get back on the bench.
You were ready to resume that part of your
right.
career.
So, and I think that was no secret to the governor at that particular time.
Did you receive indications after 1980 that when a judgeship would open that the governor would be
give me
inclined?
some consideration.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that brings us to 1983.
83? Yes.
And what came open?
Julia Gibbons went to the district court.
Judge Julia Gibbons was then a circuit court judge in Memphis.
Yeah,
and
she went to
the federal bench.
That's right.
Appointed by President Reagan to the federal bench.
That's right.
And so did you get a second call from the governor?
Second call.
Did you get another dinner at Grisani's out of this?
I didn't get it. I guess they discovered it's a cheaper way to get the message to George in. We don't have to spend money on a dinner.
So Governor Alexander appointed you to the circuit court bench.
Right. He has the distinction of appointing me twice.
And you were on the circuit court bench for 22 years.
Right.
Having been in this courtroom where we sit today, for a few months as an appellate judge, now you went to the trial bench.
Right.
Did you enjoy actually being closer to the action in the trial bench than you were in appellate advocacy?
I enjoyed the trial bench immensely. In retrospect, I don't think I would have enjoyed the appellate bench as much as I enjoyed the trial bench.
What was it you enjoyed about the trial bench?
At the trial bench, you're where the rubber meets the road. You're right where the action is. It's a speaking court, I call, rather than a writing court. The action is fast. You move in and out of matters fast. You really, as a judge, have more power because you are a committee of one on the trial bench, as opposed to being a part of a panel on the appellate bench. So you have the ability to be more creative, have the ability to be more in control of either the legal activity or your life, so you got an ability just to make a more direct impact on the lives of individuals at the trial bench than you do at the appellate bench.
So as it turned out, you found that, you believe, more rewarding than you would have found the appellate bench.
Absolutely.
Where did you get your training to be a judge? What judicial school did you attend?
Well, the only training that we have for being a judge is training that you go to after you have been selected to be a judge. There's a judicial college out at the University of Nevada in Reno. And of course, I have attended several courses there. But I think the place that I probably got the most training other than practicing law was the time that I was on the school board. That might strike you or some others odd. Wythe Chandler and I talked about that.
Wythe Chandler, former judge and former mayor of Memphis.
Former mayor. I think that having had public service cause one to present oneself as a judge as an extension of your public service rather than to take an approach that you're now on high and people are supposed to kiss your ring. So I don't think you come to the bench as enamored over your position, having been in the public eye before. Training, everything that you do in your life trains you to be a trial judge. Every experience, good or bad, trains you to be a trial judge. I think those persons that become, have the potential of becoming outstanding trial judges are those that come to the bench with a wide range of diverse experiences.
Did you have role models as a judge when you went on the bench?
Well, the answer is yes. I remember practicing and trying cases in front of Judge Odell Horton. I remember trying cases in front of Judge Bailey Brown. And they had a demeanor that I wish I could have emulated. I don't think I could, but at least there was this role model for, that I could aspire to be and have that kind of demeanor. So in terms of role models, I just like their judicial demeanor. There's some others, of course, that I shall not name, whose demeanor I was not enamored with.
You during the
That
year...
was one other judge.
Sure.
And that was Slick Williams in criminal court. I found him to be decisive, and I found him to be fair, and to call strikes, strikes, and balls, balls. And I found other judges that kind of leaned. I thought they might have brought their own attitude and philosophies to a particular case. But with Judge Williams, I thought that he attempted to just look at the case and leave his own opinions and issues and philosophies and ideologies at home.
What were there any types of cases you really liked to try that you really enjoyed being the trial judge in?
I think the tougher the better, because if the case was an extraordinarily difficult case, more often than not you had extraordinarily well-prepared lawyers to try the case. I guess I can say now that I'm off the bench, there were certain lawyers, you're going to enjoy trying their case, like a Gary Smith, somebody like that, a Leo Bierman.
What were the qualities of these trial lawyers who you enjoyed practicing?
Well,
practicing in front of?
they were, one, well prepared. Number two, they were collegial and courteous to everyone involved in the trial, whether it was opposing counsel, whether it was the judge, whether it was the parties. They seemed to, I guess, respect the institution of the trial, and at the same time effectively represent their clients. I think I didn't like acrimony. I didn't like incivility. And I found that you could do a good job as a lawyer and at the same time be courteous.
How did you deal with lawyers in your courtroom who did not demonstrate civility?
Well, one, I tried to remember that everybody cannot be like some of these lawyers that I named. That the lawyer has the responsibility to represent his client, and if he or she gets right to the limit of civility, the lawyer has that right. I may not like the lawyer dancing right close to that line, but as long as the lawyer didn't cross that line. And I would never embarrass a lawyer. Well, I wouldn't embarrass a lawyer without warning the lawyer that the embarrassment is about to come. In other words, I might, speak private and say, hey, you're getting close to this line. And then the next time, you're getting close to this line. And I remember probably one of the last cases that Joe Brown, who is now TV actor Joe Brown, tried in. And it was back time when we tried paternity cases. We don't try them anymore with DNA. And Joe Brown is a very bright individual and very colorful. And Joe would take over a courtroom. And so I would call him up and say, Mr. Brown, you're getting close to the line. And then I call him again, and then once you're getting close to the line, and the third time I said, if you cross this line again, you cross it at your peril. You get my drift. Mm-hmm. So in answer to your question, I would make every effort to communicate in a way that you can adjust whatever you're doing rather than to embarrass the lawyer and try to take into consideration that lawyer's demeanor and approach to trying the lawsuit may be different than what I want it to be, but the question is whether or not it is within the bounds of what he is allowed to be.
Judge, I've got to ask you about something because I had the fortune of appearing before you during your 22 years, and I really want to, this is probably unprecedented in the history of the Tennessee Bar Oral History Project, to pass you some cards and ask for the benefit of our of the people seeing this interview. This is as close as I can get to that says yes.
No.
No, and the third is?
I don't know.
All right. Why don't you tell us what that refers to, and if you're familiar with these type of cards in a courtroom setting?
I know you're enjoying this.
I've waited for years for this.
Bill, I have no idea how I came up with this. But what I did learn is that I listen a certain way, and I'm able to listen more effectively if I ask you, say, well, are we going to be able to finish this trial this week? And lawyers say, well, Your Honor, I have 4 depositions, I got 1 expert witness, and then I got my client to put on, and I still don't know whether we're going to be able to finish. In your opinion, whether or not we're going to be able to finish. So somehow I concluded that it was just better just because you lawyers would say, Your Honor, will you direct the witness to answer the question, yes, no, and then the witness may explain. And I concluded that what was good for the goose is good for the gander.
So you actually prepared, as I recall,
yes,
cards.
Cards, right.
And they would be at the counsel table in your courtroom.
That's right.
And you would direct those of us who appeared in front of you,
right,
if we had to right, if you wanted us to, wanted us to, yeah, direct us to use the cards.
Right. It got to the point that all I had to do was just point to the cards. And then the lawyers say, okay, I get your drift.
Now, there's something else that was unique about your tenure that I need to ask you about. You were personally responsible for changing the court schedule for all 9 divisions of the Shelby County Circuit Court in terms of motion hearings. And would you tell us about that and what brought about that decision?
Well, the way you said it sounded like I just, as a result of judicial fiat, changed it.
That's what I thought happened, but
No. Well, when I was practicing law, we used to hear what I call motions other than contempt matters at 2 o'clock on Friday. We hear contempt matters on Friday. And when I got on the bench, I discovered that many times we would start at 10 o'clock, I would be through with the contempt matters about 11 o'clock, and then we would have to wait until 2 o'clock to start the other matters. And two things occurred to me. These matters that we were hearing at 2 o'clock were some of our most difficult and challenging motions to be heard and decided upon. And number two, in my opinion, we were hearing them on the day and the time of day that most of us are least productive. At least I was least productive at that time of day. So I asked myself, is there a better way to do this? I began hearing my most important motions on a Thursday morning. If you had a motion for summary judgment, any motion that was really substantive where I could give you an hour or whatever on Thursday morning, and then instead of starting the contempt matters at 10, we decided to start those at 9 o'clock, and the matters that we previously heard at 2, we will hear those at 10, or at the time we will have completed the 9 o'clock docket. Now I confess that there was method in my madness. One was to use our time more efficiently, and the second was that if we got our work done, then the Friday afternoon would be available for those of us that engaged in other things in our lives than simply sitting around in the courthouse. So I did that in Division 6 first as a trial run, since, as I indicated earlier, that you have this much control over what happens in your courtroom on a trial level. And then once I saw how it was happening in Division 6, and others saw how it was happening in Division 6, then I proposed that we have a local rule changing that. And I'm happy to say that it's changed, and I think that most of the lawyers like the change. But I'm able to hear that if it's a very substantive motion, I'm able to give it more time without the lawyers being interrupted, say on a Thursday morning or sometime other than that Friday afternoon. So I plead guilty.
You indicated earlier that by changing this schedule, not only was more efficient, but it opened up times on Friday afternoon for, quote, other things.
Yes.
What's a prime example of another thing? I think I know. But
Well, a lot of lawyers have a need to contact a witness by the name of Mr. Green. And Mr. Green is normally found on the golf course.
You're passionate about golf.
Yeah, I enjoy golf as well as music, but golf, yes. So it freed that up.
You actually had a reputation as a judge as being kind of an advocate for a balanced lifestyle among lawyers and judges.
Thank you.
I know that you once continued a trial, very important, continued a trial important to me because you thought it was important that my wife and I go skiing, and I've always appreciated that.
Well, that's not, no, you all were going to a CLE that happened to have skiing as a dimension to it.
Thank you. What are your thoughts about judges and lawyers and about our lifestyle and balancing that?
I'm glad you asked that question. I heard a situation, since I've been off the bench, where a judge said, a male lawyer said to the judge, "Your Honor, I need to be away and off because my wife is scheduled to deliver a child, during such and such a time. And I was told that the judge responded and said that, as I understand it, your wife is going to deliver this child during this period of time, so why do you need to be away? Personally, I find that offensive. I know of situations that I've heard where judges were, in my opinion, simply insensitive to the fact that the lawyers have lives. They are somebody's son or daughter, and we have these relationships. I think it's important to have a balance. I think if one does not have a balance, whether you are a lawyer or whether you're a judge or what have you, I think that you pay a price as an individual, you pay a price as a member of a family, and in all likelihood, the profession pays a price. So, in other words, in circuit court, we schedule cases, and if, as you say, if somebody came in a timely fashion and say, well, this is my week to have time with my kids, I'm a divorced parent, we have planned this trip, we've done this, I say, have you given timely notice to the other side? And let's see, can we work it out? 9 times out of 10, you can work these matters out. I have very strong feelings about a balance. I have strong feelings about the quality of life. I have very strong feelings that we ought to ask ourselves from time to time, why do we enter these professions? And I think one of the reasons we enter these professions is to have a better life.
Is it isolating for a lawyer to become a judge?
You mean for a judge to be isolated?
Is it when a lawyer takes the bench, puts on black robes?
My opinion is no. In fact, I think it's dangerous to allow yourself to be isolated. I felt good when lawyers come around and say, well, how's your golf game? I said, well, it's like the military, left, right. I think that it does not have to be isolating. I did not find it isolating. I think that we ought to continue to be involved in community activities. We ought to be involved in some boards and commissions in our community rather than to isolate. I think we ought to continue to play golf or play tennis or do whatever. One of the things, I was in a tennis club, and I continued to be involved in that tennis club even now that I don't play tennis. And one of the benefits of the tennis club is that it never allowed the people there to get too big for your britches. And so I think the extent to which judges stay involved in the community, it continues to humanize the judge.
In our closing minutes, I want to ask you about this era of your life now. Your wife, tell us about your wife.
All right, my present wife is Lillian Hammond Brown. She is a native Memphian. We will celebrate our 9th year marriage in May. My first wife passed away, and Lillian's husband also passed away, and we have been fortunate to find each other and to have a blended family and enjoy our lives together at this point.
Where are your children now?
Well, she has one. He's in Memphis, and my 2 are in Memphis. All in Memphis. All of my grandchildren, 5, all 5 grandchildren in Memphis. So the whole tribe resides in Memphis, which is a blessing.
And you're doing some mediation now.
I am.
Tell us about that.
I do quite a bit of mediation. It's a wonderful way to continue my professional life. I am involved with Resolute Systems. I probably do maybe an average of 6 mediations, 4 to 6 a month. and I have become very active locally as well as in the international College of Mediators, and it's simply a rewarding experience to continue to help people in that capacity and draw on my experiences of being a judge in the capacity of being a mediator. The last thing I'd say about that, Bill, is I tell people in mediations, I say, look, when I was a judge, I have power. I had power. I say, as a mediator, I have no power at all. I tell them that they are the customer, and the customer's always right. So it's a pleasure to go there knowing that I don't have to make the decision, that the plaintiff and the defendant has to make the decision, and it's my role to assist them in arriving at a decision.
Finally, Judge, I have to ask you, again, you've long been an advocate of a balanced life, a life in the law, but a multifaceted life. So in addition to mediation, what are you doing these days?
Well, in addition to mediation, I travel quite a bit. I probably, we're probably out of town a minimum of a half dozen times a year. And I probably would do it even more than that if my wife would permit us to go. She said, there's more to life than travel. I said, well, tell me what that is, and let's try that too. So I spend my life trying to spoil grandkids, traveling, playing golf, playing the piano, and mediating, and probably in that order.
I understand you have a personal trainer now.
I go to the gym twice a week, Bill. I recommend that highly. If I did not have that obligation, I consider it an obligation, I'm not sure I would get up and exercise as he makes me do every Monday and Wednesday. I get there at 6:30 in the morning.
Well, Judge, you've had an extraordinary life, and you continue to have an extraordinary life. And on behalf of the Tennessee Bar Foundation, I want to thank you for sharing that with us today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very blessed to have been a part of this profession for these number of years. It's been extraordinarily gratifying.